Hey everyone, welcome to week 10 of the Oregon Conference Free Methodist Experience. This week we're going to be looking again at the Evangelical Awakening, and we're especially going to look at one of the main doctrines that came out of the Evangelical Awakening for Wesleyan theology, and that is the pursuit of holiness. Sometimes you will hear this called entire sanctification, perfect love, the pursuit of perfection, entire sanctification. It has all sorts of names that we come across. But it's a big part of who we are as Free Methodists. So let's go to Bristol in 1739. So last week we looked at Aldersgate, Wesley's moment of feeling his heart strangely warmed. Well, after Aldersgate, Wesley fought feelings of depression and doubt. He's there writing in May about Aldersgate. His heart is soaring. In his October journals, he's talking about how depressed he is. So he goes and spends some time with the Moravians in Herrnhut in Germany. And he engages with them over the issue of continuing sin after salvation. What does it mean to sin once we are saved? And he's actually going to split with the Moravians over this in 1740. He hits rock bottom, though, in January 1739. 3 months later, though, he receives a summons from George Whitefield, the great preacher, to come and join him in Bristol. Charles Wesley, that's John Wesley's brother, opposes this, as do many of the Fetter Lane Society Methodists. But Wesley eventually ends up going after the society draw lots. That may seem a little surprising to you. Wait, here's early church leaders. Are they gambling? What, they're using lots to decide what God wants to do? Understand there's actually practice in the New Testament of the church doing this, just interestingly. But Wesley eventually ends up going after drawing lots. Once in Bristol, this is the moment when the evangelical revival goes from being centered on one man, George Whitefield, and his preaching, to being a major movement. It is the true start of the evangelical revival. John Wesley starts his field preaching as many as 14,000 people in one day. That is a heck of a lot of people for the 1700s. These were not urban areas of millions of people. No, these were much smaller towns and cities. 14,000 in one day is astonishing, and that's just within a few weeks of him starting. His brother Charles, who really didn't want him to go to Bristol, starts doing more of the same thing in London. So John, Charles, and George, they start traveling, growing all over the place. John Wesley will end up doing 2.5 million miles on horseback during the next few decades. In fact, Wesley spent so much time on his horses, he got very attached to them and was really happy to be able to say that as far as John Wesley was concerned, he was going to be with his horse in heaven. John, Charles, and George are going to get ostracized by the Church of England along the way. Primarily because they would come into an area, and if you want to preach in a Church of England church, you need permission to preach from the bishop who oversees the churches in that area. And they would just walk in and start preaching. If they got kicked out the house, they would preach on the street. Kicked out the church. They would start preaching on the streets, in the parks, in the fields. However, they still saw themselves as Church of England clergymen. They were all ordained in the Church of England, and Methodism in England will not split from the Church of England until the 1820s. So that's after the death of John Wesley. In John Wesley's lifetime in England, Methodism never separated from the Church of England. That was never Wesley's goal. So there were several things that happened in this evangelical explosion. The first was field preaching. Churches, even prisons, could be off limits as an arrival. So they would gather in fields, 20,000 or more, not unheard of. Whitefield and Wesley were a huge part of this. Hymn singing became another big part, driven especially by the lyrical genius of Charles Wesley. Charles Wesley has given us hymns such as, "And can it be that I should gain an interest in my Saviour's blood? Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing my great Redeemer's praise, the glories of his grace." So many of you, "Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King." For the evangelical explosion, these hymns served as a way of teaching theology. They were a way of singing the faith, it was called. And these hymns and songs are very theologically rich, as it can. To think of hymns like "And Can It Be," where you get phrases such as where it's talking about the immortal dying, and you have phrases like, "In vain the firstborn seraph tries to sound the depths of love divine," as this verse talks about just the mystery of the immortal dying. Very rich language in a lot of these hymns. I mean, even if you look at some of the famous bits of "Hark the Herald Angels Sing," "Veiled in flesh the Godhead see, hail the incarnate deity, pleased as man with man to dwell, Jesus our Emmanuel." So rich in its theology and imagery. Then was the printed page. Wesley would write over 233 original works, including his own New Testament translation, in which he anticipated 6,500 of the alterations that the Revised Standard Version would make over the King James Version in the 1800s. That's a phenomenal amount and a testament to his scholarship and his level of knowledge of Greek. So the evangelical explosion also had a strong social justice heart. Wesley would hold to the transformation of society through the transformation of individuals. Bring Jesus into the lives of people, help them deal and fight sin as an individual, and then collectively they will be able to transform society. Some scholars have even credited Wesley with preventing an English Revolution. The French Revolution, no, the American War of Independence happened. The French Revolution happened. So in France, the common folk overthrew the nobility. That never happened in England. Why? Because the social needs of poor people got met on a huge scale by the evangelical revival in England. And so they didn't feel the need to rebel and revolt like they had done in France. Organization and discipline had a big role to play in the revival as well. Ultimately, George Whitefield, who invited Wesley to become a part of this, he was a better preacher. He had more converts, but bar a few exceptions, such as the Welsh Calvinistic Methodists, generally, Whitefield's followers did not develop into groups of people that became churches and movements, but Wesley's did. Because Wesley brought structure. Wesley instituted the band system that we've looked at, a framework for supporting the message of holiness we're going to talk about. He had class leaders working the crowds as he preached. So here's Wesley preaching in a field, and people are being converted, and then there's someone coming, finding that person who converted, and pulling them into a discipleship system of the classes, the bands, and all that we were talking about last week. And he also organized these ministers that could go and keep traveling in his stead, itinerant ministers and lay preachers. He used class leaders, lay leaders, band leaders. Men and women. The first female lay preacher in Methodism was 1824 in British Methodism. So that lets you know women preachers have been around a while in the Methodist movement. But what I really want to focus on this week is the message of this evangelical explosion. You've learned a lot of things about how it happened, how it was organized with the preaching, the hymns, the social justice, how all that wrapped together led to this great evangelical explosion. But this week, what I really want to focus on about this revival is holiness, the message of the revival. Here's a challenging verse for you, Matthew 5:48. Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. There is the challenge. Be perfect as God is perfect. So what is sanctification? So this thing you're about to come across, you will hear it called Christian perfection, entire sanctification, perfect love, the pursuit of holiness. So just understand whichever word I use of those, I'm talking about the same thing. So what is sanctification? In short, it is a word to describe the transformation of a Christian that happens after justification, in which they become more like God. Okay? It is part of the process of salvation. So going through, through prevenient grace, convicting grace, justifying grace, regenerating grace, sanctifying grace. And it's that bit that comes, we've been restored, we've been justified, we are seen as sinless by God. The guilt of sin is dealt with. Sanctification is that stripping away of the power of sin in our lives over many years. That being said, it has been viewed differently by different Christian traditions over the years. If you were to go into the Eastern Orthodox churches, they would talk about a process called theosis. And literally at the end of the theosis process, upon dying, one becomes God, becomes a part of God, kind of thing. It really, that sounds heretical to you, I do a really bad job representing it. It's a much more mystical approach to Christianity is Eastern Orthodoxy, and it will sound strange to your Western ears. And I butcher it. I encourage you to go and read more about theosis, because it's very interesting and fascinating. In the Reformed churches, they'll talk about a continual process of sanctification, but ultimately they will say a sinless Christ-like state will never be achieved until after you have died. In the Wesleyan churches, though, we're going to say it's a continual process, and there can be this definite moment in which the perfection of love is fully achieved in this lifetime, and we'll look at this in a little more detail. I want to talk one word here though, crisis. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's this huge giant crisis in a person's life. A crisis just means a moment. There is a point, and we'll talk about that a little bit in time. So here we go, perfect love. Sanctification from the Wesleyan point of view, a misunderstood doctrine. It is the most misunderstood doctrine of the Methodist Church. Of all Methodist churches, UMC, British Methodist, Free Methodist, Independent Methodist, Holiness. Thomas Oden, whose book you've been reading, wonderfully says it this way: perfecting grace is admittedly a difficult doctrine to express perfectly. And the confusion actually comes from multiple areas. First of all, the terminology used. The terminology shifts and changes all over the place. It's also tied a lot to 18th century understandings of words that we don't carry anymore today. And also a misunderstanding of how our English word is translating a Greek word, and the two words don't necessarily match up very well. There's a misunderstanding over it's a process or a moment, and there's confusion as to how it relates to work. Especially one of the charges that has been labeled against Wesleyans over the years is legalism, and that's not what entire sanctification is. So let's go through the terminology issues. We have a myriad of terms that you're going to hear that convey different nuances. So Christian perfection. This was the term initially used by Wesley in describing sanctification, and it got him in hot water a couple of times, mostly because of how we understand the word perfection. And that's going to be one of the biggest challenges in you really grasping this. How much fluidity will you let your brain have over how you have normally understood perfection? Perfect love ultimately became Wesley's preferred term. because for him, sanctification was about becoming to the point where we love like Jesus loved. And we don't become these kind of weird, omnipotent, all-powerful beings that never sin, because ultimately we're finite. We can't get away with not hurting people because we'll never be able to read other people's thoughts and things. Entire sanctification. This is often used in relation to the moment aspect of sanctification, especially groups emphasizing that perfection in love is possible during our lives. Free Methodism has a doctrinal statement on entire sanctification. It is one of our big things. One of the few changes made to the Methodist Articles of Faith when B.T. Roberts founded Free Methodism was he put in one on entire sanctification. It's often used to that moment aspect, this idea that there is a moment in our lives, in this earth, before we die, where we can end up loving exactly like Christ. I'll explain that in a little bit. Holiness, set-apartedness, is also a word you hear. Often it refers to the end goal of maturity in Christ. I could write there perfection in Christ, and you will have that revealed to you why in a moment. And then finally, the pursuit of. You'll often hear this, the pursuit of perfection, the pursuit of holiness. You will often hear. So what you have here, though, are 5 different terms. They overlap considerably, which means often they will get used a little interchangeably. Sometimes mean occasionally they get misused. So that is the first terminology issue here. Second one is going to be misunderstood as perfection. The Greek word behind this is teleotes. Teleotes is a beautiful, beautiful word. But the trouble being, it doesn't really have a good English translation. You will sometimes see it, I say translated here, really the word should be glossed, as perfect, mature, or complete. Most modern translations actually choose mature. Back in Wesley's day, they used to use perfect. So the King James uses perfect. The RSV uses perfect. A lot of more modern translations will use the word mature. The issue here is the English term and the Greek term don't get used in the same way. So translating teleotes into perfect doesn't quite match up, but even putting mature. But so you'll find this phrase in things like Matthew 5:48 that we looked at earlier. You'll find it in Paul in Philippians chapter 3. We who are mature used to be translated we who are perfect. We who are pressing on towards maturity, pressing on to perfection. And here's the linguistic translation issue. The English term perfect is from the Latin term perfectus, which is a static, finished understanding. It is the end goal of finality. When we think of something as perfect, you do nothing more to it, because to do something more to it would be to destroy its perfection. There's that point where you're painting a painting and it is perfect, do no more. But up to that point, it is not perfect. It is still a work in progress, and then the perfection, that is the final thing. At the very end, it becomes perfect. That is how the English language understands perfection. The Greek term, though, is very different. It has a fluid sense of movement and change to it. It is a continuous changing that is still perfect. B.T. Roberts explains it like this. If you have a tomato plant, you can plant the seed and water it, and it starts to grow. And at that stage in its life, it can be said to be doing perfectly. It is a perfect germinating plant, but it is not yet finished in its end. So it grows into a sapling, and the sapling is doing perfectly. And then it gets to a point where it grows and the flowers emerge, and it can still be said to be doing perfectly. It is a perfect tomato plant. Yes, there's no tomatoes yet, but it is perfect. And then we get to the point of a tomato plant with its perfect tomatoes, and it is doing perfect. So here there is a constant changing, a perfection that is perfect while still growing and developing. It is maturing. It is perfect at every step of the way. That is actually a very different thing than our brains usually process perfect as. Perfect for us is often static, but perfect in this doctrine is fluid. Remember that as you read these things. Perfection here is fluid. Now, the next thing that comes up in terms of misunderstanding it is it a process or a moment? So often, they'll often talk about, you'll hear Reform people, it's a process through our lives, and then when you die, what happened with Wesley is he said that moment where you can become perfect, where you can love like Jesus, not going to happen in your lifetime. So there must be this moment in your lifetime. And so what happened, though, was people began to get confused because it's both. This really came out in the Pentecostal expression of Wesleyanism later in the early 20th century. And you'd start hearing phrases like, have you had your second salvation? And it would grow. There's this, the doctrine is that you will gradually be sanctified. You'll have this moment, but then you can continue growing afterwards. Remember, this is a fluid form of perfection. It got kind of lost in translation, a little bit of that, and they kind of just saw this as there's a justification moment and a sanctification moment. It was almost static in between, and it kind of got seen as like a second salvation. But so we're back into that place of where heresy is easy when you go swing far too to one extreme or the other. Some people overemphasize the process. Some people overemphasize the moment. The reality is it's both. The other thing that's got misunderstood about it is that it has its association with the means of grace that we'll look at in a minute. See, the Wesleyan view of sanctification allows for increased growth through cooperation with grace. This is often led to us being accused of being legalistic. It is not. Understand that there is no attempt to earn justification in Wesleyan Methodism. This is about the salvation process after justification. Sanctification is still a work of God. Perfection is still a work of God. Holiness is still a work of God. It cannot be done apart from God's grace. But if we cooperate with grace, rather than resisting, we can kind of accelerate the process. If we sit there resisting grace, we will get nowhere. But if we keep surrendering, keep that posture of letting grace do the work, then it will drive onwards. So here's kind of the 11-point summary of perfect love. This is Wesley's own 11-point summary. And usually what happens is someone starts asking me a question about one and the answer is in another one. So let's go through Wesley's 11-point summary. So if you want to really wrestle in with this doctrine, these are the 11 points to get to know. 1. There is such a thing as perfection, for it is mentioned in Scripture. Let us go unto perfection, says Paul. It is not so early as justification, for justified persons are to go on unto perfection, Hebrews 4:1. But it happens before we die. Okay, these first three make sense. If we're saying that it happens during our lifetimes, for St. Paul speaks of living people that were perfect, Philippians 3:15. Let those of us who are mature, can also be translated, let those of us who are perfect. So let those of us who are teleotes. So it's something that happens in our lifetime. So we expect it to happen between justification and death. It is not absolute. Absolute perfection belongs to not to humankind, nor to angels, but to God alone. Nor does it make a person infallible. None is infallible while they remain in the body. This, I think, is the most important one to understand. We do not become God. We do not suddenly become infallible creatures. We are finite beings, not infinite like God. Do you know what that means? That means that we will make mistakes that are not necessarily rooted in sin. You can love someone so intently, but because we are finite, we might still make mistakes. We might still accidentally hurt someone in a completely unintended way that is not sinful. We cannot read minds. We are not God. I love this one. Is it sinless? It is not worthwhile to contend for a term. It is salvation from sin. Remember, this is all about the process of salvation. The process of being restored to what we were made to be. Wesley often didn't deal in absolutes. 7, it is perfect love. This is the form it takes. Wesley's going to say that to be fully sanctified is to love as Jesus loved. Sin is about being focused on yourself. Love is about being focused on others. It's that change from being self-focused to focused on others. This is the essence of it. Its properties are inseparable fruits, are rejoicing evermore, praying without ceasing, and in everything giving thanks. 1 Thessalonians 5:16 and onwards. It is improvable. So you can keep working on it and growing and becoming stronger at it. It is so far from lying in an indivisible point, from being incapable of increase, that one perfected in love may go and grow in grace far swifter than he did before. So what is he saying? When you hit this point where you click and the battle against sin in your heart is complete, you get to this point where your growth in grace is just exponentially growing. It is immiscible. You can lose it. You may become perfectly sanctified and then backslide. You may start resisting grace. Remember, that's always a distinctive of Wesleyan theology. You can lose your salvation because of our free will. We can choose to start resisting Jesus again and lose our salvation. Perfect love, that moment, is preceded by both, followed on a gradual work. That slide I just went back to, it is both moment and process. But is it in itself instantaneous or not? Wesley doesn't answer this question directly. He just says, it is often difficult to perceive the instant when a person dies. There is an instant in which life ceases, and there must be a last moment of its existence and a first moment of our deliverance from it. So not necessarily the work instantaneous, but the moment can be seen as that point where the progress is going, and then you cross a specific point on the journey. Now, we talked about how we can partner with grace to grow this and move forward. The main way, the backbone of the pursuit of holiness has been the means of grace. Now, the church has always held to means of grace, means by which God conveys his grace to humankind. You've already read about these in class. Traditionally, this has been baptism, communion, and word. So, word and sacrament. However, in the Wesleyan theology, Wesley took the means of grace and expanded it to so many more areas that he felt when we were able to connect with God, live out God, and connect with God's grace. And he divides them into two broad categories, piety and mercy, as ways in which we can engage God's grace and pursue holiness. These are places we can go to engage with God and accelerate the sanctification process, where we can go and pursue holiness in all we do. Piety. First of all, as individuals, we can pray, we can fast, we can search the scriptures, we can pursue living healthy lives. All things in which we can connect with God. As a community, we can do communion, we can do baptism, we do Christian conferencing. Think of that as your small groups, the band system, community accountability, things like Celebrate Recovery, those kind of things. Means of grace, where we meet as a community in the image of the triune communal creator and learn to live that out. He'd then also talk about works of mercy. Again, individual practices include things like doing good, visiting the sick, visiting the imprisoned, feeding and clothing those in need, earning, saving, giving all that one can, so good financial stewardship. And then together we can seek justice, oppose slavery. This is where that social justice heart of the evangelical revival came from. Pursuing social justice is a means of grace, a means for us to connect with God and be part of bringing his justice into the world. It is why it was such a part then. It is why even today in the Free Methodist Church we are such strong advocates of women's rights, of opposition to slavery, and of tackling racism. We see that as a communal practice of the means of grace that we engage in together. We pursue God by doing his work, by going where his Spirit tells us to go and meeting his Spirit there, where the Spirit is moving in the mission field. Furthering our growth in God. So here's things about the pursuit of holiness. One, we can live through as though wholeness is possible. Here's the big thing about Methodism. You can live as though wholeness is possible in this lifetime. Because it is. Don't live as if wholeness is something that you will only achieve after you die. Don't live as if everything in this human life of yours is throwaway. This isn't a come to Jesus moment then. You can drop it all. And then when you die, all is good. This is a we will push onwards. We believe that I can love in this world, not only in the next. Also means we have to have intentionality with the means of grace. That is where we will foster our growth in love. That is where we will become more like Christ. And it is in becoming like Christ that society will be transformed through the transformation of individuals growing in love and holiness. It also means this is something we do in community. On the left, with a big red X through it, there's a picture of someone stood up on a cliff and someone down below. That's the person who says, I am more holy than you. That isn't the pattern of the Church of Jesus. It's not the pattern of Methodism to say, we are holy, you are not welcome. The pursuit of holiness is about us helping each other get closer to Jesus. Helping each other up the hill. Each person helping the person just behind them. So that we all climb up towards Jesus together. In short, holiness means this. There is hope for this life, not just after death. Hope for this life, not just the next. Hope that in this life, in this world, even before Jesus comes back, love can enter in and love can transform. Love can redeem and grow and change people's lives in this world as well as the next. That is what holiness is all about. So here's a quick summary for us. So first of all, the doctrine of entire sanctification is an important part of the Methodist identity, including Free Methodism. It has been referred to as perfection, perfect love, entire sanctification, and holiness. The practical pursuit of holiness in our lives is important to Free Methodists. For the means of grace are an important part of pursuing holiness. That's your summary of today's. So your assignments this week, reading. There's some discipline reading. There's a chapter from the Odin book that you all have. I've also got a PDF from John Wesley for you to read, The Means of Grace, to dive into the means of grace a little more. And then also, if you want to read it, John Wesley's sermon on Christian perfection. I would really recommend you reading that if you have time. Wesley's sermons are a really good way of diving into a lot of our identity and who we are. Discussion questions. This first question comes from an ordination question asked in Methodist churches and is worth thinking about. Are you going on to perfection? Are you earnestly striving for it? Are you resolved to devote yourself wholly to God and His work? 200 words max. And then your pastoral question this week. After preaching one Sunday on the pursuit of holiness and reaching perfection in love during our lifetime, one of your congregation confronts you after the service saying that we cannot be free from sin until after our deaths. To pursue perfection is therefore a distraction from our real mission of winning more souls for the Lord. How will you deal with this congregation member? 150 to 200 words. So with that, have a great week. I will see you online. Bye.